Welcome to Whispers of Dharma, where stories of karma, compassion, and rebirth are softly told to heal the soul. Pause. The prayer bells in Dr. Sarah Chen's meditation room had been ringing on their own at 4:44 a.m. Pause. Every morning for 3 weeks. Tibetan incense burned continuously now, its smoke carrying whispers of sandalwood and memories that didn't belong to her current life. Pause. On her altar sat a photograph of an elderly Tibetan monk, a stranger whose eyes felt like home. Pause. But this morning was different. The bells rang 13 times instead of 7, and in the mirror behind her altar, Sarah saw not her own reflection, but the face of a young woman in ancient robes, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. Pause. When compassion transcends death itself. Pause. How far will karma reach to complete an unfinished act of love? Sarah lived between 2 worlds in the heart of San Francisco's Richmond district. Her modern apartment overlooked Golden Gate Park, but inside, Tibetan prayer flags hung alongside medical diplomas, creating a sanctuary where East met West in quiet harmony. The sound of morning fog rolling past her windows had become her daily meditation bell. Each wisp of mist a reminder of the Buddhist wisdom she'd been studying since medical school. Each gentle movement of air an echo of the compassion she'd always felt called to practice. For months, Sarah had been experiencing something she couldn't explain to her colleagues at the hospital. Dreams of monasteries she'd never visited, knowledge of Tibetan prayers she'd never learned, an overwhelming sense that she was searching for someone she'd promised to help. As a trauma surgeon, Sarah saved lives every day. But lately, she'd been haunted by the feeling that there was one life she had failed to save. Someone from another time, another existence, whose face appeared in every reflective surface, calling out for healing that transcended the boundaries of a single lifetime. The dreams had started 6 months ago, always the same scene. Sarah found herself in the body of a young Tibetan woman named Tenzin, living in a mountain monastery in the 1950s. In these visions, she was not a doctor, but a novice healer, learning the ancient arts of Tibetan medicine from her beloved teacher, Lama Norbu. The old monk had gentle hands and eyes like deep mountain lakes, and in the dreams, young Tenzin would sit beside him as he taught her about the delicate balance between healing the body and healing the spirit. True compassion, he would say, sees no difference between self and other. It flows like water, finding every crack in suffering and filling it with light. But the dreams always ended the same way. Pause. Soldiers coming to the monastery, shouting in a language that brought fear. Lama Norbu, ill and weak, being dragged away as young Tenzin watched helplessly from behind wooden prayer wheels. In the dream, Tenzin would always reach out, always try to follow, but her feet would be rooted to the ground. Pause. And the last thing she would hear was Lama Norbu's voice, carried on the wind. "Promise me, child. Promise you will find me in the next life. Promise you will finish what we started." Sarah would wake with tears on her cheeks and the taste of barley tea on her lips, a flavor she had never experienced in her American life. But more than that, she would wake with an ache in her chest, the weight of a promise made across lifetimes, a debt of compassion that remained unpaid. 3 weeks ago, everything changed when a new patient arrived at her hospital. Pause. An elderly Tibetan refugee found collapsed in Golden Gate Park with no identification, no family, no one to claim him. And when Sarah looked into his eyes for the first time, she saw the face that had been haunting her dreams. His name was Norbu Tenzin, the same name from her dreams, but reversed, as if the universe were playing with the threads of rebirth, weaving past and present into an impossible tapestry. He was dying, his body worn by decades of exile and hardship. But when Sarah approached his bed that first night, something extraordinary happened. The old man's eyes opened, and instead of confusion or fear, they filled with recognition so profound that Sarah felt her knees buckle. He reached out with a trembling hand and touched her face, speaking in broken English mixed with Tibetan. "Tenzin, my precious student, you came back. You kept your promise." Sarah's colleagues thought it was dementia, the ramblings of an elderly patient, but Sarah felt the truth resonating in her bones, in her blood, in the deepest chambers of her heart. That night, sitting beside his bed, Sarah began to remember things that weren't memories. They were echoes from another life, another body, another time when she had loved this man as a daughter loves a father. And she understood that rebirth wasn't just about returning to life. It was about returning to love, to promises that transcend the boundaries of death, to compassion so deep that it carved pathways through time itself. But as the old man's condition worsened, Sarah realized that modern medicine couldn't heal what was broken in him. This wasn't just about his failing body. It was about completing something that had been left unfinished when the soldiers took him away all those decades ago. Sarah began staying at the hospital long after her shifts ended, learning everything she could about Tibetan healing practices that existed beyond the scope of Western medicine. She consulted with monks at the local Tibetan community center, studied ancient texts about the connection between spiritual and physical healing. But more than research, she found herself simply sitting with Norbu, holding his hand and listening as he shared memories that felt like returning to a home she had forgotten. "In Tibet," he whispered one evening, his voice barely audible above the hum of medical machines, "we learned that some illnesses come not from the body, but from the heart, from promises broken, love unexpressed, compassion interrupted by the cruelties of the world." As the days passed, Sarah began to notice something impossible happening. when she was present, truly present, not as Dr. Chen the surgeon, but as someone whose soul remembered being Tenzin, the healing student. Norbu's vital signs stabilized. It wasn't medical science. It was something deeper. The healing power of recognition, of love that had survived death and rebirth to find its way back to wholeness. But Sarah also began to understand that this reunion came with a price. The Buddhist wisdom she'd been studying taught that some souls remain tethered to earthly existence because they have unfinished business, debts of love and compassion that must be settled before they can find peace. She realized that Norbu had been waiting, perhaps for decades, not just to die in peace, but to die knowing that the love he had given to his student in that mountain monastery had found its way across lifetimes to bloom again in a different form. And Sarah understood that her promise, made as Tenzin so long ago, was not just to find him, but to help him complete his final teaching as his body prepared for its last transition. The dreams had started 6 months ago, always the same scene. Sarah found herself in the body of a young Tibetan woman named Tenzin, living in a mountain monastery in the 1950s. In these visions, she was not a doctor, but a novice healer, learning the ancient arts of Tibetan medicine from her beloved teacher, Lama Norbu. The old monk had gentle hands and eyes like deep mountain lakes, and in the dreams, young Tenzin would sit beside him as he taught her about the delicate balance between healing the body and healing the spirit. True compassion, he would say, sees no difference between self and other. It flows like water, finding every crack in suffering and filling it with light. But the dreams always ended the same way. Pause. Soldiers coming to the monastery, shouting in a language that brought fear. Lama Norbu, ill and weak, being dragged away as young Tenzin watched helplessly from behind wooden prayer wheels. In the dream, Tenzin would always reach out, always try to follow, but her feet would be rooted to the ground. Pause. And the last thing she would hear was Lama Norbu's voice, carried on the wind. "Promise me, child. Promise you will find me in the next life. Promise you will finish what we started." Sarah would wake with tears on her cheeks and the taste of barley tea on her lips, a flavor she had never experienced in her American life. But more than that, she would wake with an ache in her chest, the weight of a promise made across lifetimes, a debt of compassion that remained unpaid. 3 weeks ago, everything changed when a new patient arrived at her hospital. Pause. An elderly Tibetan refugee found collapsed in Golden Gate Park with no identification, no family, no one to claim him. And when Sarah looked into his eyes for the first time, she saw the face that had been haunting her dreams.
But as Norbu finished speaking, alarms began to sound. His heart rate spiked, then plummeted, and Sarah felt the old fear rising, the terror of losing him again, of watching helplessly as someone she loved slipped away. Without thinking, Sarah pressed the call button for the medical team, her training taking over. But as doctors and nurses flooded into the room, Norbu caught her hand with surprising strength. "No," he said firmly, "this is not the time for machines and medicines. This is the time for the deepest healing of all." Sarah looked into his eyes and understood. This wasn't a medical emergency to be solved. This was a sacred transition to be honored. "Let me go with love," Norbu whispered. "Let me complete this cycle, knowing that what we began in the mountains of Tibet has found its completion in the compassion you carry in this life. This is how rebirth truly works, not just returning, but returning with more love, more understanding, more capacity to heal." Sarah made a choice that her medical training had never prepared her for. She gently asked the medical team to step back, to let this moment unfold as it needed to, not as protocol demanded. And in that space of sacred witnessing, something extraordinary happened. Norbu's labored breathing became peaceful, and Sarah felt a warmth spreading through the room that had nothing to do with the hospital's heating system and everything to do with love completing its circle across impossible distances of time and space. Norbu died as the fog outside cleared, revealing the first stars of evening. Sarah sat with his body for an hour, feeling not grief, but a profound sense of completion. The weight she had carried for months, the ache of an unfulfilled promise, had lifted. For the first time since the dreams began, Sarah felt fully present in her own life, in her own body, in her own time. She understood now. Karma wasn't just about punishment and reward, debt and payment. It was about love finding ways to complete itself, compassion creating bridges across the seemingly impossible gaps between life and death, self and other, past and present. Norbu had not been suffering because he was dying. He had been suffering because he had unfinished love, a teaching incomplete, a student left behind, a promise that needed to be witnessed and received. And Sarah had not been haunted by random dreams. She had been called back to a love that refused to be limited by the boundaries of a single lifetime. The compassion she had felt for her patients, the inexplicable drive to heal that had shaped her entire career, it had all been preparation for this moment. In Buddhist wisdom, she had read that some souls choose difficult paths not as punishment, but as service. They return again and again, taking on the wounds of the world, until they learn to transform all pain into healing, all suffering into understanding. Sitting beside Norbu's peaceful body, Sarah realized that she was such a soul, and that this lifetime, this work as a healer, this meeting, this completion was not an end, but a graduation to deeper service. True healing, she understood now, happened not just in operating rooms, but in moments like this, when love was allowed to finish what it had started, when compassion was permitted to flow across every barrier that seemed to separate one heart from another.
The next morning, as Sarah prepared to leave the hospital, the head nurse approached her with a puzzled expression. "Dr. Chen," she said, "the strangest thing. We found this in Mr. Norbu's belongings. Apparently, he'd been carrying it for decades." She handed Sarah a small wrapped package, worn smooth by countless hands and years of travel. Inside, Sarah found a traditional Tibetan healing crystal, the kind used by monastery physicians centuries ago. But wrapped around it was a note, written in English in the same shaky handwriting she'd seen in her dreams, with a date from 20 years ago. The note read, "For my student Tenzin, who will find me when the time is right. The healing you seek to give others can only be complete when you understand that every act of compassion echoes across lifetimes. Use this well and know that love never dies. It only deepens." But the real surprise came when Sarah looked at the note more carefully. At the bottom, in faded ink, was an address in San Francisco, the exact location of the trauma center where she had chosen to do her residency 15 years ago. Sarah realized that Norbu had not found her by accident in Golden Gate Park. He had been searching, guided by the same promise that had called to her in dreams, drawn to the place where he somehow knew his student would be healing others, waiting for their paths to cross once more. And there was one final gift. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from the Tibetan Community Center. A young medical student, recently arrived from Tibet, was looking for mentorship in combining traditional healing practices with Western medicine. When Sarah met her that evening, she looked into eyes that held depths beyond their years, and heard a voice that said, "I've been having dreams about a teacher I'm supposed to find. Someone who understands that healing happens in the space between worlds." Sometimes the greatest healings happen not when we cure illness, but when we recognize that love creates commitments that outlive our bodies, and that compassion, once truly given, becomes a living force that finds ways to complete itself across any distance, through any obstacle, beyond any ending we thought was final. If you believe that karma always guides us, please subscribe and leave a reflection so we can awaken together. This is Whispers of Dharma. Every story is a seed of wisdom. See you again in the next whisper.